Well, hi everyone. So today I'm going to talk to you about documentation and how to make better ones using static website generators. But first, let me introduce myself. So I'm Alex, like it was in the previous slide. I'm a software engineer at Algolia, and my main occupation is to be the lead of Instance.js. But also as a side topic, I do build documentations for our main libraries. And truth is, at Algolia, we love documentations. We have a dedicated team for building our main documentation. We also have this project called Doc Search to add doc search in your documentation for your open source projects. It now powers popular libraries such as React, Vue.js, or Laravel. And also, our main libraries have their own dedicated documentation websites. So in this presentation, I want to focus more on these documentation websites. But first, let's go back in time. I want to tell you a little story. It all started 2 years ago in late 2015. We were about to release Instant Search JS v1. Instant Search is a library to build search UIs. And this was our first version, so we wanted our documentation to be just right. So that's why we wanted to use Jekyll. Someone doesn't know Jekyll, maybe? I can explain. Yeah, okay. So it's a popular static website generator. It has been popularized by GitHub because it's built in using JS pages. So you can learn more about that on GitHub. So we wanted to use Jekyll, and we wanted to use Jekyll because it was a perfect fit for us, because we had already at this time a very opinionated point of view on how to make libraries, documentation for our libraries. For us, a good documentation should be useful. It should contain all the information that the user requires. It should be friendly. The newcomers and the experts should be at ease with this documentation. And also it should be appealing. We didn't want to leave a first bad impression. So this is how it looked back then. And for us, Jekyll was very great. But on the other hand, we had JS doc written all over our source code to document everything. So JSDoc is a tool that generates those kind of websites. And so you can see the output is not quite as the same as the previous screenshot. The idea is that we think that a documentation should have a seamless experience. You shouldn't go from the good landing page to sort of more sparse design when it comes to reference API, where you have everything about your API. So if we were to use both, we would have break the sort of conversation between the users and the documentation. But really, there are two JSDoc when we talk about JSDoc. One are the annotations that you have in your code. So when your functions take parameters, you just say, okay, I have parameter A, parameter B. This is a standard. And on the other hand, you have the tool itself. And the tool actually transforms the annotation in your code into a website. And there are reasons why we want to keep the annotation and not write a doc separately like in a HTML5 directly. First is exhaustivity. All the comments that you write in your code will be transformed into your website. And also, we want, there's another property that we like, is the collocation. The doc lives where the source code is. This means that when you update your code, when you update your API, it will be, it's more likely that you will update your documentation when you do this update. So an interesting point about documentation generators is that they are actually static website generators. But just, and so documentation like that, so they are the ancestors of them. They were created around 20 years ago, back at the beginning of the internet. So remember the website from the previous presentation? Yeah, that's the kind of feeling that they had. And so obviously they didn't have the same kind of tooling. For example, they had a poor templating system. They had no CSS preprocessor, so no Sass, no whatever. And also they had no modern JS stack. So what could we do to mix Jekyll and the JS doc together? And for that, you need to understand a bit about how a documentation generator works. First, it extracts the comments from the source code. Then it organizes the comments into parts that make sense. And then it outputs all of that into HTML and CSS. But what if we didn't apply the theme, the HTML and CSS, and instead export that as Markdown? And we were not the only one thinking about that back then. Yeah, actually, Lodash is a popular library on the JavaScript world. And the documentation of Lodash is based also on JSDoc annotations. And what they do is that they transform the JSDoc annotations into Markdown files, and then they integrate that into their websites. And you probably have, if you are a JavaScript developer, you probably have seen this documentation. It's pretty well integrated, very nice to use. So we decided to do something similar. And what we did is that we created a script that generates the Markdown as well. And we integrated that Markdown using the templating system of Jekyll Liquid. To transform the annotations, we use a tool called JSDoc to Markdown. And so this is the results that we get. So in this view, you can see that we are using the 3-column layout that was pretty popular actually at the time. So in the middle, you have actually editorial content, which is like content that is written by human, so people are like at ease. But also on this side, we have the reference API, which actually documents everything about the API, any options with small comments about what the option does. So these results, we got it 2 years ago. And since then, we have continued to dig into this approach. So now let's move forward to now and see what we are doing. And the first thing that we've changed is the stack. So the first thing, we changed the stack. And basically, we moved to Jekyll to something called Metalsmith. Metalsmith is was interesting for us because first, it's not focused on blogs, whereas Jekyll is very focused on blogs. Also, it's written in JavaScript, and I work in a team of JavaScript developers, so it was really no-brainer for us. And also, it's easy to build plugins, so to be able to extend it and to fit it to our needs. For the templating system, we're using Pug, and for the CSS preprocessor, we're using Sass. Also other stuff. And the last thing we did is that we added a plugin for documentation JS. I'll talk more about that afterwards. So because now we have a full stack of JS stuff, we can go a step further into the integration of the documentation. Now we can completely bypass the rendering part and integrate at the organized comment step. And the truth is that documentation, the new tool, is of great help here. Documentation JS is a tool like JSDoc, and it's fully compatible with the JSDoc comments. It's under active development, which is not really the case with JSDoc, and also it has built-in JavaScript API. And this API really helped us create this Metalsmith plugin. So let's have a look at the Metalsmith architecture in order to understand how we do the integration. Really, Metalsmith is responsible for only two things: reading the source files and writing the files at the end. And in the middle, you have plugins. So the plugins will be responsible for different modifications. And what are plugins in Metasmith? Basically, you can think about them as simple functions. On the input, they take files, such as, like, for example, Markdown, and they output a file. In this case of a plugin that would generate HTML from Markdown, it would take the Markdown file, transform it, return an HTML file. So what we did is that we integrated documentation.js into a plugin. Our plugin has two steps. The first steps actually extracts the documentation data from the source. It uses in these steps documentation.js itself. And the second step organizes the documentation into files. This is our specific logic for our documentation. One thing to note at this point is that the data is still not structured into an HTML file. It's still pure data. And it's the subsequent plugin job to actually leverage this data and transform them into actual documentation. So in our pipeline, we then have the Pug plugin, and this plugin will be responsible to transform the data into the actual HTML file for our documentation. We use actually two parts in this plugin. For this plugin, we use templates for the different kinds of stuff that we want to document, and mixins for repetitive stuff like how to display a type, how to display a function, stuff like that. So about that, the results of this new step is that we can still have editorial content with reference documentation. We use now tools that we know, that you might know also, and also, but also it requires some time investment. So what would be the benefit of investing more time if we can't go further? And that's the thing, we can actually get more from our documentation with this kind of approach. So I want to show you in this part some examples of key features that we've added in our documentation based on this approach. And so let's start. So one thing that we've added is that we have on every page an edit this page button. And instead of going to Markdown files, we go to the source file where the JSDoc lives. The thing is that JSDoc is more structured, so making an edition is more straightforward. And also because it goes to GitHub, it's easy for a new contributor to actually open a pull request right away. Let me show you. This is how it looks. You have the edit this page button. Let's see if I can do that right. Will it work? Yeah, it worked, but I just, well, okay. Oh, yes, this is live. So I'm here, I see my documentation, and as a user, I see that something is wrong. So what I do is I go and edit this page. Yeah, so, and now I have the source code, I can do the edits. At the bottom of the page, I can just commit these changes and create a new commit and start a pull request. Yeah, so, well, how do I go back to my presentation now? Oh yeah, perfect. So yeah, so that's for easing the contribution, but we can go further than that and sort of trying to reorganize the documentation based on the topics. That's good. Okay, so when you build a library, the API can be separated in concepts. And in Instant Search, we really wanted to sort of organize the documentation around the learning curve of the users. A beginner does not want the same thing as an expert user. And because we want to help our users navigate the website first, we organized everything so the most practical concepts should be shown first. Also, an advanced user might have a sort of an idea of what they want. So that's why we integrated doc search in this part. So they can actually just search and they will go directly to what they want. And this reorganization of the documentation is actually done based on the JSDoc data. Also, in JSDoc, you have this annotation for adding examples. and that's good. However, it's good when the user actually get to know what they are getting at the end when they use a part of the API. So what we did is that we made those examples runnable and integrated directly in the documentation. So this is how it looks. And let me try to see that. Yeah, so here I have an example of a menu widget. You can see that it's in the menu. And if I click run, boom, it will show me the menu widget with the context of a search, because we're doing search after all. I can play with the search and see that everything is moving. So, okay. Then I can play with it. It will change my results. So now I'm convinced that I want to use this widget. And so I go there and just click here. And then I have my example copied and I can reuse it in my own source code because all the examples are sort of consistent. Basically, it's just a matter of copy pasting it in your own source code. That's it. Yeah. Also, we can go even a step further because of this knowledge of the data, the raw data. You can sort of generate the usage in a form that is close to the API itself. It's a we can do that, and we should do that because it's a non-formal way of seeing the API. It's more close to what the user will use. Yet we can give them more information. So let me show you. Uh, So here I have this usage, and it's full of links actually. And so if I want to see a specific option, I can just go and click, for example, on attributes. What are attributes? Okay. So label definitions for the different filters. Okay, nice. In the context of using the library, it makes sense. And I also go and click on the different types that I've defined, and I will have the description of all the API that I will use. That's it. And what if we want to go further? And what if actually what we want to document is not actually the language level API, but more of a concept level API? What if we are like doing React, for example, and we are trying to document components, which may be classes or functions? And so because we master the whole stack, we can actually add new tags into the comments. We can enrich the JSDoc standards, and we can output them in the generated documentation. How it looks. So in this case, we have this concept, which is a higher order component. It has those new properties called exposed props and provided props. This is very helpful, and this is contextualized to what we know about our framework. So yeah, that's about it for the sort of sample of the features that we've added. So now I want to tell you that actually all what we are doing on documentation is actually quite experimental. We go as we need new stuff, and so it's an iterative process. But really think that in the end, trying to integrate the documentation in the pipeline of static website generators will be something that will rise in the next years. So let's review some thoughts about the stack first. So Metasmith is a great tool. Really, it's super small and it's really, really easy to hack. There might be other tools that fit you, no worries. And actually, we want to hear about if you have tried to integrate any documentation with any other static website generators. Also, other languages could benefit from this approach. I mean, I'm thinking Java, I'm thinking Ruby, or whatever, Python. It's really a really powerful way of thinking, and it can really change the way you create your documentation. It's not just one thing that is on the side, and it's really something that we can manipulate and we can make it appealing to the new users. So now let's talk a little bit about the code semantic of JSDoc. The truth is that JSDoc is not perfect. It's actually typing. So you say that your parameter is a function or or is a string or a number, whatever. But actually, it doesn't check anything. So you can say that a function is a number and it doesn't care. So one thing about documentation is actually that it supports flow as typing. So it would add a double bonus if we were to integrate that, and we want to integrate that, to actually write the type in Flow, let Flow checks the types and check the consistency of your whole code base, and then also have a documentation that is actually accurate, completely standard and everything. So small note here, I have nothing against other type language in JavaScript. I hope they will be supported soon. So in conclusion, documentation is key for a successful library. You don't have to rely on old stack. You can hack them. And really, documentation is data. We can harness it to make great documentation. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Hi, thank you for giving your talk. Out of curiosity, do you use the same tool for generating maybe HTTP API or REST API, or do you rely on existing solutions?
No, for the API that we use at Algolia, we rely on good old-fashioned text by hand. We don't have automated documentation for APIs.
Okay. Did you try something like maybe a Swagger or Ramel, or is it isn't in your roadmap?
It's not in the roadmap.
Okay.
I don't really have the answer to why we don't do that, but yeah, it's not on the roadmap.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot for the presentation.
Thank
Can you provide a few examples of the custom annotation that you created in your superset of the JSDoc commands?
Yeah, I can show the source code.
Yes, that will be awesome.
Okay, let's do that.
For example, while you're looking for it, at some point you made a demonstration of the uses of a given class or type. Was that, I think that's what I got from the context of your demo at some point. You were clicking on the type, I think, and it was you showing examples of code that use that type.
Okay,
or
so
something related.
this case is the usage part. So in this part, actually, we don't do anything custom here. It's just we actually leverage the knowledge of the types, and we actually output that in a specific mix in Pug. So we just say, okay, so we have a property. We know that we're going to have an object as a parameter. So let's look at all the properties in it. Just go through it one by one, and we check the type that is linked. And so I also mentioned that we are reorganizing the documentation. So in each page, for example, on the widget page. Okay, so I will try to, yeah. No, can't do that. Yes. So that's one's the one. So, yeah, what did I want to say? Yeah, so here we are reorganize each widget to have all the types in a single page. So that's why we are doing that. And so not to have, that's one of the problems in the mostly generated websites. You have to link, you have links about types, and you just go everywhere, and it's just a mess. In this case, we know of our libraries, and so we know of all the types that are related to a single widget, and we display them in the same page.
Okay.
And here are just like custom types that are defined using JSDoc, something very standard in JSDoc.
Okay, so this, for instance, this was not a custom command.
No.
Not a custom annotation. No. So what custom annotation do you use then?
So we use them to sort of describe stuff that are not, for example, you have a parameter that is a standard annotation. But for example, if you have a component, you don't really have parameters, you have like props. So we added an add props and add expose props and add provided props for the higher order components.
Oh, okay.
Does that answers your question? Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? No, we're good. We're good. Okay. Thank you very much for listening.